Hi, my name is Doug McGlumphy and welcome to my exhibition, Monumental. The exhibition is a lot about materials and how those materials inform ideas. This particular show is a lot about my experience with my family farm, and these are remnants of those projects that have happened on the farm. I always like to start out with my talks about materials in general, so that will help sort of inform you and give you some information about the work itself. So with my students, I always start out with, what is this material that we're looking at? It is barbed wire. It's a roll of barbed wire. And then I typically ask them what kind of things are associated with barbed wire. Often their first answer is cows. And so I'm like, absolutely, right? It's an agrarian sort of material. It can keep animals in or it can keep animals out. Then they typically talk about, it could be prisons, keeping people in, keeping people out. It can also be about war, keeping, again, one side versus the other side. And so materials, even though I haven't built anything with this material, it still has this embedded meaning with that material. And so that's what I try to play with when I'm working with those materials that we have found in and around our farm or our area in Tuscarawas County, Ohio. This piece is called Broadside, and it is made up of many different materials. Primarily, it's made up of a large side of a barn and tobacco leaves and a deer head. The deer head was my great-grandfather's hunting trophy that he got when he was in Pennsylvania. It deteriorated over many years until all of sort of the outer skin and stuffing fell away from that. The barn has been in existence probably since the early 1900s, and it was salvaged in about 1998 that we moved to our farm. And the tobacco leaves, of course, have been drying for about 3 years. So those materials combined with the title of the piece, Broadside, is what is the meaning behind this particular piece. So a broadside is literally the broadside of a barn as two words. So that's what we're looking at here. It can also be associated with, you can't hit the broadside of a barn, so that's a hunting reference or a throwing reference. And so that's why the deer head is here to reference that. But a broadside can also be a ship battling, two ships battling that come together on their broadsides and fire back and forth to each other. But it can also be a political broadside. So to me, the main sort of idea behind this piece is a political broadside. It's a, if you look down at the barn, it is a chew mail pouch tobacco sign. So that is a corporate logo. But then behind, sort of in the dark shadows, is the hanging of tobacco leaves. And these tobacco leaves were purchased in southern Ohio, in Adams County, Ohio, from migrant workers who were harvesting the tobacco. And so that's sort of the underside or backside of the corporate logo, is that our needs depend on sort of this migrant working population. And in Ohio, we have a lot of migrant workers that come to the farm and support various operations. And so we really do depend on those workers to get our daily food and needs. So the title of the piece behind me is called United We Stand, and it is made up of columns or porch posts, a ratchet, and a flagpole. And so this one is pretty straightforward in my mind, that we need to all come together during this time of strife, right? We have a war going on in Ukraine, so that could be trying to pull us together, pull countries together. So to me, the columns or the posts in that particular idea is about countries coming together. It also was made during the pandemic, obviously, so that could also be the idea of sort of coming together to overcome the pandemic, or it could also be our political ideologies trying to come together. It's ratcheted together with a contemporary ratchet because I think those ideas are so current and that we need to pull people together and ratchet them together. It's not just tied together loosely, but it's like we have to sort of force people together. So that's the idea behind that. There is the flagpole, and the flagpole is intentionally left without a flag in order for you to interpret it either as a Ukraine or as the current political situation or whatever you want. This piece behind me is called Migrant. This particular piece is made up of hundreds of crates, and there's nothing actually physically binding them together, and it is very precarious in how it's standing, but that is relating to the idea behind the work. So the title references the idea behind it of Migrant. This piece was inspired by the pardoning of Joe Arpaio by President Trump in 2017. And the idea that the migrant workers were being rounded up and sort of sent back to where they came from is the idea behind this particular piece. So again, just like Broadside references migrant workers, this one also does that in the fact that all of the crates are either turned upside down or sideways, and so if we don't have that working force of migrants, that we would not have all of the things that we become accustomed to in our grocery stores. We depend on those people to help us, and we all depend on one another. It also has some patriotic imagery that is embedded in the crate labeling, which here's the Liberty Bell. There's also Uncle Sam's hat in the federal crate up there. There's also Native Americans that are represented here in this particular crate. And for me, those crates are speaking to sort of the idealism of the American experiment. The scale of this piece references not only the title of the show, Monumental, but I think the idea is a very large idea and has a lot of consequence depending on how we treat people who immigrate to the United States and our migrant working population. This piece is titled Glory Days, and it refers to not only for me sort of a personal story, but it also, I think, can be expanded to everyone's story or a lot of people's stories. This particular piece is made up of materials that were found from my background and my family's background. It was a school in Stone Creek, Ohio, where my grandmother taught, my grandfather was on the school board, and where my father's first job when he graduated actually from W&J, and he went to his first job at Stone Creek High School in Stone Creek, Ohio. So as you can see, there's a basketball hoop at the very top. There's flooring that is salvaged from the actual school that was torn down in the 1970s. There's a megaphone that was my mother's when she was a cheerleader at the high school. There's a chair, an educational teacher's chair. There's also some library books that are actually from the Stone Creek High School library. And then there's a band hat and a suitcase that says Stone Creek Panthers at the bottom. There's also a bench that I'm sitting on as part of the piece. So these reference sort of my history and the idea that the importance and hierarchy of things sort of within my families and how we grew up. Basketball was at the top. My dad was a basketball coach and high school teacher. My mom's experience of being the cheerleader, she was also president of her class. She only had 8 in her class, so it was a very small rural school. And then the books are referencing how important education was to us in our family. The chair, as you can see, is not an ideal perfect chair. It is a broken chair. And for me, the brokenness is sort of referring to our broken educational system, right? Maybe back in the 50s when these things are from, that was the ideal. But to me, going forward, right, we want to rethink about what our education is and how we move forward from there. My dad, of course, thought about basketball at the very top, but then he also referred to as sort of the band people and the art people, which is what I am, sort of hanging on and being at the bottom of that. For me, it's referencing glory days. They're his glory days, right, or my parents' glory days, but not necessarily mine. So as you sit on the bench, you can sit and look at and sort of stare up at those things that were important to others, or you can turn this way and sort of walk away from that and think about your own path forward. I collect these materials over time, and I'm often just very attracted to a particular material, and I don't necessarily know why or what that's going to become in the future. So we have a lot of outbuildings, so I store them, and then an idea will come, and I'll be like, oh, that's the perfect material for that particular piece or to get that idea across. So often it's a connection to the material first, and then the idea sort of comes along. And then as the idea develops, I may add something, right? This particular piece, it started out with just the chair, the circle, and the basketball hoop, but as time went by, I kept feeling that I needed some additional, not just for a visual standpoint, but for the concept of the idea. So that's why I continued to add different materials to that. I like telling stories visually, right? I think my pieces, I think people often respond to the size first, to the material sort of second individually, individual components of the pieces, but then I think that gives them access to understand or to comprehend the story behind each one.